Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and explore the fascinating insights hidden within.
And today we're really diving deep into the history of the United Arab Emirates. We're guided by this comprehensive paper, A Brief History of the United Arab Emirates.
Right, and this document, it takes us on quite a journey, doesn't it? Tracing the UAE from, well, ancient roots right through to the dynamic nation we see today.
Exactly. It covers so much early inhabitants, external influences, how it was formed, that incredibly rapid modernization, and its place in the world now.
So our mission today really is to unpack the key moments, the big transformations presented in this document to help you understand the forces that shaped this modern nation.
There's a lot there. From pearl diving to petrodollars, nomadic tribes to these incredible skyscrapers. It's a remarkable story.
It really is. Let's get started then. Where does the source begin?
Well, it takes us way back to the deep past, long before the UAE as we know it existed. It focuses on the Arabian Peninsula and its connections, with Persia, the Indian subcontinent, Mesopotamia.
And it suggests human presence goes back surprisingly far.
Yeah, incredibly far. Around 5000 BC is what the source indicates. There's evidence of Chalcolithic, Bronze Age settlements, mainly in the eastern part of the peninsula.
Wow. And the paper talks about shifts during that pre-Islamic time.
Oh, yes, significant shifts. Between the late 5th millennium and 3000 BC, you see real advances. Things like agriculture, animal husbandry, and the start of permanent settlements, even early urbanization.
So moving beyond just simple huts.
Right. The source contrasts those early reed and palm huts with later walled settlements made of mud and straw bricks, much more substantial.
And other changes happening alongside that.
Yeah, copper metallurgy becomes widespread, and we start seeing the very earliest forms of written evidence appearing around this time, too.
Interesting. But it wasn't all about settling down, was it? The source mentions nomads, too.
Correct. It explains how, alongside settlement, new forms of nomadic life developed, centered on herding, which was obviously crucial in those harsh conditions.
Yeah.
This led to the sort of distinct Bedouin way of life.
With Arabic as their main language.
Primarily, yes. And the paper makes a good point. This shift between settled life and nomadic life wasn't like a clean switch. It was fluid, back and forth, and in some ways it's still ongoing, even now.
And the idea of Arabia itself back then.
The source says it often just referred to the whole peninsula, not a specific modern country. And those surrounding civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, they documented numerous Arab kingdoms existing in this era. It wasn't empty land.
So a time of a lot of movement, transition.
Exactly. Migrations, social upheaval, shifting power. But the source emphasizes that amidst all that change, the Arabic culture provided this lasting foundation. Diverse, yes, but also unifying in many ways. It endured.
Okay, let's move forward a bit. The source brings us to the rise of Islam.
Yes, and it links it very closely to the life of the Prophet Muhammad, born probably around 570 AD in Mecca.
Which the source describes as a really important city. Trade, religion.
A major hub, yes. And understanding that pre-Islamic context is key. Identity wasn't about nations as we think of them. It was race, kinship, alliances, vendettas even. Very tribal.
And the Kaaba in Mecca.
Central. It housed idols then. Though the source is careful to note, the Quran itself doesn't give like a detailed list of the specific idols or the Kaaba's pre-Islamic history.
Got it. And then the revelations.
Right. The source discusses Muhammad receiving divine revelations starting around age 40. He uses this metaphor of a celestial book, essentially identical to the Torah and Gospel, kind of reminding humankind of forgotten connections.
That's a powerful image.
It is. And the source draws on what's called the Sirah literature. That's the historical narrative of Muhammad's life. It mentions hardships he faced, like the death of his wife Khadijah, which eventually led to the Hijra, his flight to Medina in 622 AD.
And the source distinguishes the Sirah from the Quran itself.
Crucially, yes. The Sirah is the history, the story. The Quran, according to Islamic belief and the source, contains the divine revelations themselves, considered to have word-for-word invariability, a key distinction.
Okay, fast-forwarding again. Early 1500s, external powers start taking an interest. The Portuguese arrive.
Yes, drawn by the wealth of the East, basically. And their strategy, as the source describes it, was pretty aggressive.
How so?
They focused on controlling those narrow sea straits, Hormuz, Oman, Aden, building forts like at Hormuz, Diu, Mombasa are mentioned, essentially trying to establish naval supremacy in the Gulfs.
And they were active for quite a while.
Oh yeah, the source says for over 2 decades they were seizing Indian merchant ships, raiding cargoes, causing a lot of fear and disruption way beyond the Gulf, even as far as the Straits of Sunda.
But they weren't unopposed.
No, not at all. The paper details local resistance. Alliances formed. It mentions the Mughals, the Navy of Gujarat, the Raja Banjarmasin, all pushing back, which helped limit where the Portuguese could operate.
Then the Ottomans get involved.
Right. The Ottomans launched counterattacks. Eventually, the source says, they expelled the Portuguese from key spots like Ormuz and captured some of their forts.
Did that end the conflict?
Not entirely. The Ottomans lost some territory further east later on, though they held on to places like Malacca and Timor. The source even mentions specific flare-ups, like a Sultan Firuz trying to take a fort back from the Ottomans and the King of Aden declaring war on the Portuguese.
So a really contested period. Lots of powers vying for control.
Absolutely. It really highlights how strategically vital this region has always been.
Which leads us neatly into the 19th century and the British becoming more involved. Piracy was the initial reason.
That was the main driver mentioned in the source, yes. The coast there, which became known as the Trucial Coast, was a haven for pirates. They were plundering ships, raiding settlements. It was a major problem.
And the local leaders.
They actually reached out, according to the source, sought British help to try and restore some order.
Which led to agreements.
Yes, the paper outlines key ones. An anti-piracy agreement in 1820. This put the Emirates' external political affairs under the British political resident based in Bushehr, in Persia.
But it wasn't smooth sailing immediately.
No, the source describes the situation as remaining fluid for quite some time. There were various ceasefire treaties, but they kept fluctuating, weren't always stable.
And Dubai starts becoming more important around this time.
Definitely. The source highlights the establishment of a British consulate there in 1856, a clear sign of its growing importance as a trading port.
There's also mention of a bribery agreement.
Yeah, 1854. It sounds a bit blunt, but the source says rulers basically pledged not to destroy towns if Britain didn't interfere internally. The Qasimi ruler of Sharjah is mentioned as benefiting from British protection in exchange for, sort of, stepping back.
But the really big shift came later.
Seems so. The 1892 treaty. The source describes this as the point where British authority was fully entrenched. The Emirates essentially agreed not to make treaties or give up territory without British consent.
And Britain's reasoning for this?
Protecting their own interests, primarily. The source mentions worries about Russia expanding into the Gulfs and instability in neighboring Persia. So these advisory treaties were signed, creating what became the protectorate states.
Okay, the source also looks at the formation of the Trucial States from a slightly different angle, right? Going back to the 1820s again.
Yes, it emphasizes Britain's need for order to protect its trade monopoly with India. So they started dealing with individual tribes, recognizing specific ruling sheikhs.
Like the Bani Yas.
Right, on the western part of the coast, modern Abu Dhabi and Dubai. An accommodation was reached there. But the paper notes there were conflicts too, partly because the Bani Yas wanted to dominate and Britain was trying to, limit that ambition.
And Britain sometimes backed specific leaders?
Yes. The source mentions encouraging Sheikh Zayed III of Abu Dhabi, though his rule was short, then backing his son, Sheikh Zayed, to regain control. And later, Sheikh Zayed II's successful coup, which apparently had help from the Qasim.
What else was happening after 1820, according to the source?
Well, Bahrain briefly gained control of the East Coast, apparently linked to competition and maybe the decline in the pearl trade. But that led to dissatisfaction and a separate Eastern Coast Confederation forming.
And Britain took forceful action against piracy sometime?
Oh yes, the source mentions a joint British-Omani cannonade in 1822, specifically targeting Qasim pirates. And Sheikh Sultan of Sharjah eventually yielded after a British bombardment in 1825. He was caught between piracy and British power.
So, a really complex period.
Very. And the source is quite upfront, saying it's still hard for historians today to definitively judge how successful those British actions in the 1820s were in guaranteeing long-term peace.
Right. Let's jump forward again to the game changer, oil.
Absolutely. The source paints this incredibly vivid contrast. On the one hand, the historical landscape, camels, caravans, date palms, tuna fishing, oases, these mysterious old forts were quasi.
And the other?
The modern reality, 7 wonders of the 21st century, skyscrapers, artificial islands, luxury shopping, a completely different world.
The source connects this back to earlier history too, doesn't it?
Yeah, it briefly recaps some earlier points mentioned in this section. Stone Age hunting, finds of gold chains and coins, Islam's arrival around 630 AD, Lunar calendars, trading ships, the roles of sheikhs and qadis in later classical times, just grounding us before the big shift.
And then oil hits?
And other minerals too.
Oh.
The source describes it powerfully, like igniting this thirst for riches right there in the sands. And this, it suggests, was a major factor leading the seven emirates to eventually come together.
It uses that phrase, crystals of independence.
Yeah, suggesting this wealth fueled a desire for a new charter, maybe moving away from older conflicts or fanaticism. It definitely sped up the path to actual independence.
When did that formally happen?
The protectorate status ended December 1st, 1971. British military withdrawal was complete by December 15th. That cleared the way for the UAE to be recognized internationally as an independent sovereign nation.
With Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan as the first president.
Correct. And the formal structure came soon after. A new constitution took effect February 10th, 1972. This created the federated nation state we know, single federal government, president, council of ministers, but with two levels, federal and emirate.
The source points out an interesting difference in how the UAE became independent compared to others.
Yes, it notes the UAE's independence basically happened by default when the Protectorate Treaty just lapsed. Other Gulf states often had specific withdrawal treaties that formally handed over authority.
Did that difference matter?
The source implies it contributed to challenges. Holding the new federation together, preventing political division or social breakdown, was apparently an urgent imperative. There were, according to the paper, lots of reasons not to unite different economies, administrative styles, territorial disputes, even conflicting loyalties. Yet they pushed for unification.
And how did the oil wealth shape early economic strategy?
The initial focus, the source says, was heavily on using public funds oil money for big infrastructure projects, services, and kickstarting industry. It notes there wasn't as much traditional private sector initiative initially, and national firms kind of struggled compared to foreign companies who kept control of the really high-value parts of the economy.
Okay, let's dig into the formation process itself a bit more. It started right after the British announced their withdrawal plan in '68.
That's right. March 24th, 1968, they announced the withdrawal from Abu Dhabi specifically. And the immediate worry, the source says, was that the richer Emirates might just decide to go it alone.
So they appealed to the UK.
Yeah, asking them maybe to stay or reconsider. And the British response was apparently crucial.
What did they say?
According to the paper, they said they'd only consider staying if at least 5 of the Emirates agreed to form a federation before the withdrawal date. Otherwise, they were definitely leaving.
That must have focused minds.
It seems so. A key meeting happened almost immediately, March 25th in Abu Dhabi. Rulers Zayed and Rashid invited the other rulers. A committee was set up to draft proposals.
And an initial federation was announced?
In June '68, yes. Just Abu Dhabi and Dubai initially. They had a draft constitution, an advisory council. But the source notes Abu Dhabi still seemed to be assuming the British protectorate would somehow continue.
But the other 5 weren't keen on that initial plan.
They were hesitant, yeah. They held their own meetings later that month. But eventually, the discussions widened.
So all 7 came together.
By August 1969, yes, the plan included all 7. The source mentions a couple of political factors that helps a letter from an Abu Dhabi advisor in '68 suggesting a customs union, and Dubai reassuring Abu Dhabi and the British they'd collaborate. Agreeing to regular meetings between the rulers was also important.
And the final formation?
It happened right before the British left. The source mentions some regrouping on November 27, 1971, Abu Dhabi Sharjah, and then Fujairah Dubai plus Ras Al Khaimah and Al Quwain forming a federation of Arab Emirates. Then the fully constituted Union of the UAE was formally announced on December 2, 1971.
Although the source acknowledges slight variations in dates depending on the document.
Yeah, it mentions that. Different documents might pinpoint slightly different moments as the absolute formal founding. But December 2nd is the key date.
And what were the guiding principles of this new union?
The source highlights several. Each emirate keeps its internal independence. The government system should align with Islamic and Arab traditions. Laws should be based on the Quran and Sunnah, and a commitment to preserve the Islamic faith and practices, but without a total separation of state and religion.
Now, that oil wealth, its impact on development must have been enormous.
Just transformative. The source talks about a huge demographic shift first, attracting thousands, then millions of expatriate workers. Eventually, they vastly outnumbered the local Emirati population.
And the landscape changed completely.
From dusty settlements to bustling, bizarre cities, and then into these sleek, modern capitals.
Yeah.
Just incredible speed.
What about the economic environment created?
Very open, initially.
Hmm.
Free from taxation, no state monopolies in many areas. This allowed private businesses to really flourish: banking, insurance, airlines, hotels, property development, retail. That spurred local manufacturing and tourism, too. Interestingly, the source notes there wasn't even a formal legal code before 71. The early constitutions were based on Islamic principles and tribal customs.
The source mentions the idea of rentier states.
Yes, that analysis often applied to Gulf nations heavily reliant on oil income. But the paper argues it gets more complex with the UAE. There's increasing diversity between the Emirates, more international involvement, leading to what it calls developmental diverging pathways.
So the 7 Emirates weren't all developing the same way.
Not at all. The source sees the UAE as kind of an ideal ground for studying how big international financial trends play out differently at the local level. It specifically compares Dubai and Abu Dhabi's approaches, how they balance planning versus letting things happen, or protectionism versus intervention. They took different paths.
Okay, focusing on the economy more broadly. The source says the UAE is always looking to improve and diversify, especially after global shocks.
Constantly, yes. The paper points to challenges like weaker global demand at times, more competition from neighbors who are also trying to diversify away from oil, and generally tighter global financial markets.
And the big lesson from recent crises.
According to the source, it hammered home the need for a genuinely diversified economy, not just relying on oil so you can better handle future economic storms.
But oil is still hugely important.
Oh, absolutely. The source gives figures from 2008 showing oil still made up over 40% of GDP, over 75% of exports, and over 75% of government revenue. Still the bedrock.
Yet there has been progress in non-oil sectors.
Definitely. The paper notes relative improvement over the last decade or so. By 2008, the UAE was the second largest Arab economy, recently ranked the 7th strongest in Asia. That initial nation-building drive, fueled by oil money, funded an interventionist approach to spread the wealth.
What are some examples of diversification efforts mentioned?
Direct investment of oil money into non-oil sectors. Things like machinery building and maintenance, fire safety equipment, cable manufacturing, electronics, telecoms, software, IT services, projected close to 4% of GDP back in 2008. Even traditional sectors like date production, Abu Dhabi alone producing a significant chunk of the world's total.
The source also mentions the response after the 2009 crisis.
Yes, a package to deal with liquidity problems of the real estate market correction. Abu Dhabi played a big role with its financial clout. But the paper stresses the ongoing need fostering real domestic competition, moving beyond just spending oil money to drive innovation.
So diversification isn't just a buzzword. No, the source presents it as critical, both for long-term growth and stability, especially if you want to build a knowledge-based economy. It also points out, though, that there's still a remarkable disparity between Abu Dhabi and Dubai's non-oil economies and the other Emirates, even though there has been overall improvement, particularly noted in Sharjah.
Let's talk infrastructure. That rapid development we mentioned, it wasn't uniform across all Emirates.
Not initially, no. The source notes different scales of development despite them being geographically close. The oil search itself in the 60s transformed the oil-rich Emirates almost overnight from nomadic bases to modern cities. Fujairah, with less oil, saw a slower change until the oil revenues started flowing more generally in the 90s, enabling new development there too.
And the government placed a big emphasis on understanding the geology.
A key point in the source, yes. Needing high-quality baseline geological data was crucial for planning all this massive development and also for assessing environmental risks.
Which led to major mapping projects, extensive ones, commissioned by the federal government. Started in 2002, expanded in 2008. Using all sorts of techniques: geophysics, seismic surveys, drilling, ground-penetrating radar, especially focusing on the younger geological deposits in Abu Dhabi. They even reprocessed old seismic data from oil exploration to build a comprehensive geological database.
Were they looking for other resources too?
Yes, mineral surveys were commissioned, looking for limestone, industrial minerals, dimension stone materials needed to support the oil industry itself, but also for diversification. The source notes good reserves of these in the northern Emirates, like Ras Al Khaimah.
And the building boom itself provided data.
Kind of a side benefit, yeah. All the ground investigations needed for buildings, tunnels, etc. inadvertently shed light on the ancient environments of the region going back over 50 million years, revealing things like old carbonate platforms and lagoon settings.
Fascinating. Okay, alongside all this physical change, the source talks about culture, a cultural renaissance.
Since the 1990s, yes. Driven by leadership vision, but also the growth of the media industry there.
But the source presents two sides to this.
It does. It's either hailed as this vibrant oasis of culture, or it's criticized. Some see it as imposing an alien culture, or creating a kind of plastic heritage that isn't deeply rooted.
What about museums?
Their establishment and expansion are highlighted. The Zayed National Museum, the Dubai Museum, and the Al Fahidi Fort, these are seen as bringing traditional UAE architecture into the spotlight, making it a symbol of identity.
But there's a critique about architecture, too.
Yes, the source points out what it calls a perceived hypocrisy. On the one hand, unprecedented, massive changes to the urban landscape. On the other, seemingly not enough effort, the paper suggests, to document and conserve the more recent contemporary architecture that existed before the latest boom.
Are people engaging with this culture?
The source mentions museums developing public programs, the emergence of visual arts markets, people doing gallery hopping. So yes, engagement is growing.
And the media's role in all this?
It's discussed. Sometimes, the paper suggests, the media lags behind or focuses too much on the past, being ineffectively archaeological, or the sheer media spectacle of the giant new projects overshadows the need to critically document how contemporary culture is actually being shaped and reinvented through this new architecture. It also touches on the idea of cultural landscapes, how the physical environment is shaped by beliefs, and how that constantly changes meaning.
Let's widen the lens now to the UAE's place in the world, foreign relations.
Right. The source starts by grounding us, again, its location, the pre-British history, Bedouins, maritime tribes, the Bani Yas trading, then British control, 1820-1971. It also mentions a brief period from 1958 when it was part of a British mandate.
And Arab nationalism played a role.
In the 60s, yes. That's noted as a factor leading towards the 1971 Federation.
Oh.
And a fun fact from the source, the UAE was actually on Indian time until 1973.
Really? Didn't know that. What about Dubai's early growth?
Port taxes were key, according to the source. That early income helped it grow into what the paper calls a cosmopolitan metropolis is relatively early on.
And UAE foreign policy generally?
Characterized by a very expensive network, bilateral relations, lots of embassies, missions abroad, frequent visits by dignitaries. Having economic security from oil allowed it to be much more active, regionally supporting ideas for Arab unity, joint Arab actions, while also building strong alliances with Western powers.
It joined regional organizations.
Actively. The Arab League, OAPEC, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, the GCC, Gulf Cooperation Council. The source also describes it as having been a faithful ally of the U.S.-led anti-Soviet bloc during the Cold War.
Who were its closest allies mentioned?
The USA and Saudi Arabia are identified as the closest. But, the source adds, the UAE has also maintained a policy of having cordial relations even with rival powers. It even apparently passed on arms supplies from the Soviet bloc sometimes, due to historical ties.
Interesting balancing act. What about specifically within the region?
The source talks about the UAE trying to emerge as a regional power, not just economically, but politically and militarily too.
But there are challenges to that.
Big ones. The paper raises concerns about long-term investor confidence. Because the UAE is located near several regional hotspots, rising security concerns, both external and internal, are a major factor. The source argues escalating threats could really hurt its reputation for stability, which is vital for its development model that relies so heavily on foreign investment.
How is it building its military capacity?
Abu Dhabi has played the lead role, procuring a lot of advanced military hardware. This improved its position, especially after Saddam Hussein was removed in Iraq.
But is it enough?
The source offers a pretty blunt assessment here. It suggests the UAE's own defensive capabilities are likely insufficient or inappropriate to counter major potential threats, like from Iran or potentially other Arab states. This means, the paper implies, it still needs to remain under a Western military umbrella. It also mentions exploring closer ties with India.
Has the UAE faced threats internally?
Yes. The paper explicitly states that despite Dubai being a useful hub for many groups, the UAE has suffered terrorist attacks on its own soil.
And the history of its own security forces.
The first formal force was apparently in the late 1950s, initially dominated by British and Iranian officers. Later, the Dubai Defense Force, DDF, emerged, described as small but well-trained.
Which merged with the federal forces.
Yes, it was absorbed into Abu Dhabi's larger Union Defense Force in the mid-1990s. But the source points out a practical problem this created: incompatible equipment. Because Dubai had bought its own gear independently for over 25 years, they ended up with different hardware, different ammunition, which caused integration issues.
No, thinking globally. Dubai and Abu Dhabi as global cities.
That's how the source positions them, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Competing on a global stage, building networks of partnerships.
But it draws a distinction between them.
It does. It notes Dubai might have more global fame or brand recognition, perhaps. But Abu Dhabi, it argues, is unambiguously more important overall because of the sheer scale of its oil wealth and the soft power that comes with that. Used as an analogy, Dubai is often seen as an air bridge, a connection point, whereas Abu Dhabi, through its national airline and resources, is arguably the actual powerful air bridge.
The source also mentions challenges, particularly for Dubai.
Despite its success, yes. It lists things like economic crises hitting hard, what it terms an aberrant polity, meaning perhaps an unusual political system, social issues, bureaucracy, rigid regulations, problems with crime and corruption, and critically, a perceived lack of a fully shared Emirati national identity across all segments of society.
These are described as repercussions.
Yes, repercussions of its incredibly rapid rise and what the source calls an ethno-caste-driven labor market. That suggests a system where different nationalities are often channeled into specific types of jobs or social levels.
And this caused tensions.
The source points to a growing gap between the nation's stated values and the lived realities for some people, especially when the economy tightened and incomes fell. But it also offers a pragmatic view for many immigrants, it acknowledges. Even brief prosperity was better than the poverty they left behind.
What's the key for maintaining stability with such a large foreign population?
According to the paper, the continued residency of foreign workers depends on the UAE staying affluent and also on those workers adapting to local values. There's an understanding, it suggests, that the economic boom might not last forever, and the neighbors are watching how things develop.
Okay, bringing it into the 21st century, let's recap the formal start again.
Right. December 6, 1971, the union founded after British withdrawal, Abu Dhabi's ruler as president. The charter and constitution came into force about a month later, January 1st, 1972, with Dubai joining the Supreme Council then.
And Ras Al Khaimah joined later.
In June 1972, yes, after initially rejecting a British-suggested alternative union.
Were there early challenges?
Definitely. The source mentions Iranian actions concerning some islands early on. Sheikh Rashid Maktoum of Dubai is credited by the source for playing a key role in holding the fragile federation together in those early days. Sheikh Zayed, as president, launched major national development projects, but the source also mentions some foreign policy moves it calls missteps.
Then came the 80s boom.
A huge boom, fueled by high oil prices during the Iran-Iraq War. This funded massive modernization across the board. By 1989, the source says the state was in much better shape. Dubai really took off globally. Then the iconic towers, the artificial islands, eventually the world's tallest building. And Abu Dhabi built up its sovereign wealth fund into the world's largest.
What about the 90s?
Sheikh Zayed became more involved in regional politics, including what the paper terms anti-Israeli policies. Domestically, Sheikh Rashid Maktoum was pushing for the Federal National Council to have more actual power.
And the peace process.
The source mentions the start of Arab-Israeli peace process dialogue in 1992, and the UAE shifting towards a more unilateral diplomatic approach around that time.
Were there internal pressures mentioned?
Yes. The paper notes Sheikh Zayed faced challenges in restraining radical Islamic forces, alongside growing tensions between the U.S. and some Arab states.
And after Sheikh Zayed passed away in 2004?
The source mentions Dubai's market for foreign investment expanding even further, partly through investments made by sovereign wealth funds.
Shifting focus slightly to technology now, in the current era.
Yes, the source circles back to emphasize how crucial technology and that detailed geological understanding are for ongoing planning and development.
Remind us about that big geological survey.
Right. Started mapping the Eastern Emirates, then expanded nationwide with geophysical and seismic surveys, focusing particularly on Abu Dhabi's younger surface geology.
Using airborne surveys, too.
Yes. Nationwide airborne geophysical data was acquired and merged with older data to get full coverage. And those strategic mineral resource surveys continued looking for limestone, industrial minerals, even things like platinum group elements and dimension stone.
And we mentioned how urbanization studies help geology.
Exactly. All the groundwork needed for the massive building projects has actually provided unique insights into the ancient environments of the region, going back tens of millions of years.
It really is one of the most rapidly urbanizing places.
Absolutely. The source highlights how the desert landscape has been fundamentally transformed over just 30-40 years into this vast network of infrastructure.
And those headline-grabbing projects.
The tallest building, artificial islands, huge airports, metro systems, plans for high-speed rail, they get global attention. But the source points out they also offer these amazing opportunities to collect really valuable geological data during construction.
Finally, let's touch on cultural diplomacy. This is becoming more important.
Increasingly so, according to the source. The UAE is consciously using its cultural assets, events, exchanges, arts as part of its foreign policy to promote peace and understanding, using soft power.
How are they doing this?
Through lots of initiatives, cultural events, student exchanges, scholarships, professional development programs. Dubai is a major hub because it already has a lot of cultural infrastructure like galleries and museums. Abu Dhabi's strategy is described as maybe more centrally planned or coherent.
Is it a big investment?
Huge. The force describes the initiatives as extensive and varied, involving high costs and high stakes. The goal is to build considerable clout and influence in different societies globally.
Any specific examples?
The Abu Dhabi Arts and Culture Authority is mentioned as a new, ambitious body. Things like the Abu Dhabi Art Fair and various biennial exhibitions are highlighted using art to discuss world issues and also directly supporting artists from the Middle East, North Africa, and Iran with commissions and prize money.
What's needed for this to succeed long-term?
The source stresses the need for a balanced cultural environment, one that truly reflects contemporary developments and strengthens the local art scene. And crucially, it requires sustained national commitment and funding to be sustainable.
Okay, so pulling it all together, where does the source leave the UAE now?
On the verge, potentially, of a knowledge-based economy. It's achieved incredible growth and modernization, becoming a very wealthy nation incredibly quickly.
Driven by
Visionary leadership, those diversification efforts we discussed, and fundamentally, the discovery of oil. But the source reiterates the core challenge and opportunity, successfully diversifying away from that heavy oil dependence for truly sustainable future growth, learning from others who face similar transitions.
We saw the journey from a modest past
to building high-tech industries. Through direct oil wealth investment machinery, fire control, electronics, IT, software, even boosting traditional sectors like date farming.
But challenges remain from the recent global economic situation.
Yes, weaker demand sometimes, more competition, needing that domestic competitiveness, moving beyond the easy growth of the boom years.
So opportunities and risks.
Exactly. Opportunities in diversification, leveraging resources, technology, cultural diplomacy, partnerships, but significant risks too. Vulnerability to global shocks, balancing domestic needs versus international pressures, potential threats to political and economic stability, and the need for honest self-assessment.
The source also mentioned internal challenges.
Potential ones, yes. Things like ensuring national unity and coherence remain strong and managing entrenched interests that could potentially fuel domestic tensions or grievances.
And environmental pressures from all that growth.
A major consequence. Solid waste, sewage treatment, air pollution, protecting waterways. The source notes particular problems in undeveloped desert areas where solutions are harder, needing things like remote sensing to monitor. Plus, the impact of simply developing pristine desert land and integrating natural features like creeks into urban transport networks.
The source mentions security investments, too.
Yes, investment in repressive technology and multinational cooperation to strengthen the state. But it questions if this alone is enough and raises the risk of the UAE being drawn into wider regional conflicts it might prefer to avoid.
Wow, it really is a complex picture.
Absolutely. This paper provides a really thorough overview of a nation that's been through and is still undergoing just incredible transformation.
Definitely. What a deep dive that was, covering so much ground from ancient settlements right up to the UAE as a modern global player facing these really unique challenges and opportunities, all drawn from the source you provided.
We've seen how geography, culture, those external powers throughout history, and then, pivotally, oil, how all these forces have woven together to shape the UAE's story.
And it's clear it hasn't been a straight line. Constant shifts in alliances, that incredibly rapid internal change, and this ongoing balancing act between tradition, modernization, and its place in the world.
So as we wrap up, here's a final thought for you to ponder, something stemming directly from the source material we've discussed. Given the UAE's incredibly rapid transformation, so much of it driven by external factors like oil wealth, and acknowledging its vulnerability to international events, what does the source itself suggest is the single most critical element for ensuring its long-term stability and its continued ability to adapt successfully in the 21st century?